All right, thanks for joining me again for another lecture. In today's lecture, we'll be talking about UT Austin versus Fisher, but I thought I might begin today by just giving you an overview about what I'd like to do to finish the course. So as you know, the final exam is coming up, and I think what I'll do is that next week, I'll make the final exam due anytime you'd like to complete it, as long as it's done during the week. So as long as it's done by Friday, July 26th, that will do. In the next lecture, I'll tell you a little bit about what my expectations are for that test so that you can be prepared and go into the final exam fully confident about what my expectations are and how to do well. I'll make available to you a practice final, which, if you'd like, I can provide you some feedback on. So you can do the practice test and then write me an email that says, Donnie, can you give me some comments about ways I can improve? And then I'll do my best to provide feedback to you in a timely manner so that you can just be even more prepared for this final exam. So hopefully everything will come across as quite fair. I set up the final exam this way, I usually do in the last week of class, because in my experience as an undergrad, far too often I felt that professors kind of forgot that there were other classes that I was taking at the same time. And so really what I want for you is just to get this class out of the way. It's a lower level class. It's been kind of relaxing and fun and easy, I hope. At least that's how I wanted to make it for you. And I think it's just in your interest to get this class out of the way so you can focus on whatever else you have going on. I don't have an inflated sense of self-importance here about these things. I'm just appreciative that you've taken my class and have put some thought into legal reasoning. Okay, so that's basically the week ahead. There will be one more lecture in which I explain the final exam. This is our last substantive lecture where I'll talk about UT Austin versus Fisher in just a moment. So in any case, we're continuing on with our examination of race in the law. And I've chosen race again because it provides a very nice counterpoint to the idea that just because the law is some way, we shouldn't accept the law. The law as an institution made by people is subject to many biases and can constantly be reevaluated for its fairness. And I think the racial history of the US won't leave very many people in doubt that it's constantly necessary to examine laws for their fairness. So today what I'd like to do is share my screen, and then we'll go through some of the details of UT Austin versus Fisher together. Now, the case for today comes in a long line of cases, beginning with Bakke versus Regents of California. So as early as the 1970s, the United States has confronted the question of race as it relates to admission into higher education, because, as Derek Bell rightfully points out, minorities, specifically Black people, were systematically denied entry into higher academic institutions for centuries, right? And so there is this push. Given the weight of the injustices associated with racism in the US, it's necessary to counteract those in some way. But how best to accomplish this? Is it possible to do this in a way that doesn't violate some kind of equal protection among citizens? That's the question with which we'll be wrestling, and it's the question with which the Supreme Court has been wrestling for some time. But you recall that this case of Bakke versus Regents of California stood for the idea that when attempting to admit people on the basis of their race and consider one's race in college admissions, or in this case, I guess, medical school admissions, it's impermissible to establish a quota system, meaning that one cannot look at the constituency of a population in the United States, derive various percentages of the makeup of various races from that population, and then tailor an incoming class that reflects in some way that constituency, right? So suppose that race 1 makes up 17% of a population and race 2 makes up 54% of a population, be it localized or national. Bakke versus Regents of California said that it's impermissible for admission committees to make a class, to recruit a class that's, say, 17% race 1, 50-something percent race 2, and so forth. That's the kind of conduct that's been made unconstitutional by Bakke versus Regents of California. And of course, Bell, in reaction to this kind of a case, says, why not? Why is that so bad? Why can't we consider facts about historical injustice and our legal reasoning about such matters? Okay. Then in Grutter versus Bollinger, There were a pair of cases that came out in the early 2000s, and Greta versus Bollinger was the one in which the University of Michigan School of Law, their law school, considered race as a kind of soft factor. So in this holistic review, there were many different factors that contributed to an applicant's status and the likelihood of their admission, and race was just one of these factors. And the Supreme Court held that this was permissible because it didn't exactly constitute a racial quota. Race was considered a soft factor. It was permissible in that context to consider race in admissions. Now, in UT Austin versus Fischer, we learned from the case we read for today, which is Fischer II, I've put it in bold here, that several things transpired. First, because race is a suspect class, the university must explain a compelling interest that's being advanced through the least restrictive means. So we've seen this standard of review already in Roe versus Wade, but this is what Fischer I stood for, the idea that a university, if they want to consider an applicant's race when figuring out whether to admit them to a university, they need to show that consideration on the basis of race advances a compelling interest and that they do so through the least restrictive means. Now, cashed out to the specifics of this case, UT Austin is going to ultimately argue that the important compelling interest to be pursued by considering an applicant's race is viewpoint diversity. What the University of Texas at Austin would like to achieve is a critical mass of historically underrepresented students, such that this critical mass secures for the university or adequately promotes all the benefits of viewpoint diversity that they'll later identify in the case we'll read. That's the first part that they must show. Now, in doing so, a little bit of deference, the Supreme Court says, is owed to the university. They can identify a lot of different things as a compelling state interest, and while a judge might review them, they're allowed to give a little bit of deference to the university. It's not something that has to be airtight, if you will. However, no deference is owed when a university argues that there is not a race-neutral alternative that could have just as adequately secured those benefits. Maybe put another way, the university would like to show that what they'd like is viewpoint diversity. A judge might show a little bit of deference to a university that wants to establish this as their compelling state interest. That's your compelling state interest? Okay, we can give you a little bit of deference there. But you're never going to be off the hook, supposedly, for showing that there is not a race-neutral alternative that could have secured this. Oh, really? You have to consider an applicant's race when considering whether it's necessary to promote viewpoint diversity? Couldn't you have done that with a race-neutral approach, i.e. an approach that doesn't consult an applicant's race at all? Why do you need to consult an applicant's race in order to promote viewpoint diversity, after all? So those are the kind of constraints that were given to us by UT Austin versus Fischer I. In the case we read for today, UT Austin versus Fischer II, maybe we do get a little bit of difference in here. I leave that for you to decide. But importantly, for our interests, I suppose, since I've actually taught this class, a new case has come out, which is the Students for Fair Admissions versus the President and Fellows of Harvard. And in this case, the Supreme Court basically threw out the idea of affirmative action altogether on the basis that, at least as practiced at the UNC Chapel Hill and at Harvard, the goals of viewpoint diversity were not sufficiently articulated to make them capable of judicial review. In other words, a judge couldn't look at something and decide with just the facts given to him or her whether viewpoint diversity was actually being promoted. And I guess this idea has somewhat poisoned me as I've thought about the case here, because I find myself worrying, yes, how exactly do we know when viewpoint diversity is sufficiently promoted? Maybe that's just something you'll need to wrestle with too, and perhaps you'll need to figure out whether in selecting viewpoint diversity as the compelling state interest to be pursued, universities have sort of shot themselves in the foot just a little bit with respect to pursuing these goals of diversity. And you might think that had a university led with the ideas that were given to us by Derek Bell, that what really the compelling state interest is some sort of righting of historical wrongs. Perhaps if the compelling state interest were identified on those sorts of grounds, we wouldn't see as much hemming and hawing today with respect to the notion of affirmative action. So I rarely do this. I don't like to tell students what my personal views are, but in this case, I think I will. I think there's something to be said for affirmative action, qua righting of a historical wrong. As Derek Bell says, there are many historical injustices in this country, and it seems like one way we'll need to sort of reverse the tide is by making higher education accessible to those for whom it's been inaccessible for many years. And affirmative action seems like the kind of way that we could do that. At the same time, there is going to be a bit of difficulty in reconciling it with certain constitutional provisions. And it's legal reasoning, I think, that gives me the most pause. How best to do this? How could we do this in a way that's sort of fair? And is it necessary to engage in some sort of reverse discrimination to accomplish this? These are questions with which I wrestle, and I invite you to wrestle with them too. But for now, we're going to have the more limited aim of just understanding what this case is. So I think this would be a good time to sort of look at UT Austin versus Fischer and its particular details and sort of explicate them. Basically, you already know the facts, but there's a high school student named Abigail Fischer, and she fell outside of the top 10% of her class in high school, which is significant because in the state of Texas, there's a law that provides for automatic admission to the student's state school of choice if they find themselves within the top decile of their high school class. And more often than not, the student would choose to go to UT Austin, being the flagship university in Texas and being such a neat university in a cool town. It's no surprise to me that many of the high school students wanted to attend there. And in fact, it was my dream school for studying philosophy, but I didn't quite make the cut. I was denied on April 15th, the deadline, being just one slot away. For 2 years in a row, I was denied. They didn't want to take me, or they did, at least they said. I'm not bitter about it. I'm happy at Ohio State, but I get the draw of wanting to go to UT Austin. It's personal to me. Now, what UT Austin's done is they've admitted most of their incoming class, approximately 75%, on the basis of the top 10% plan. There's so many students, in fact, wanting to go to UT Austin that over the years, the 10% plan became constructively more akin to a 6 or 7% plan, just given the vast number of students who want to go there. And I wouldn't be surprised if today, maybe 3 or 4%, you'd need to crack the top 3% to be able to be guaranteed automatic admission in Texas to UT Austin. But in any case, Abigail Fischer falls outside of this threshold. And so there's still a chance that such people could attend UT Austin, but they'd be subject to a different kind of review, a review in which an applicant's whole admission file is considered, and a file in which race is considered a soft factor. Those of historically underrepresented groups in academia served to score a bit higher on this ranking than did the traditional white applicants. And so because of this, Abigail Fischer thought that the admission process was unfair, and she, of course, was denied. She later went to LSU for what it's worth. And so I perhaps would be a little bit sad too if I had to go to LSU instead of UT Austin. I don't know. Abigail Fischer sues the University of Texas, and so she's been engaged in a dispute with them ever since. And I guess maybe her fight's over now. I'm not sure. Now that the SFA versus Harvard has come out, but yeah, that's the set of facts that engenders the legal controversy here. Now, again, we're working with several constraints. From the previous case, we know that UT Austin must identify a compelling state interest. Secondly, it must be advanced through the least restrictive means. In other words, UT Austin must show that there is not a race-neutral alternative which is capable of advancing those interests that they've identified. Now, Abigail Fischer's first argument, she advances through her attorneys, is that There's this notion of critical mass that figures in the university's formulation of their compelling interest. Remember, the first task the university is considering is what exactly is our compelling interest? And the university comes back with this answer. They say, our compelling interest is in achieving a critical mass of students that is necessary to achieve, promote, and secure these benefits of viewpoint diversity. Now, we'll look at what those benefits are in just a moment. But for now, Fischer's argument is that this notion of critical mass is never sufficiently defined. This is significant because you'll recall that all the things identified by universities as compelling interest are subject to a kind of judicial review, because a judge has to figure out whether there is a race-neutral means of securing the goal. And if the goal is amorphous, how could a judge evaluate whether that goal is being met or could be met by a race-neutral alternative? So it's a real pickle. The challenge is basically the university has identified such an amorphous moving target that will never really be able to independently ascertain whether that goal has been achieved. But now let's look at what those goals are in just a little bit more detail. I said that there was a critical mass desire to secure certain benefits of viewpoint diversity, but what are these benefits? Well, the benefits are the promotion of cross-racial understanding, the breaking down of racial stereotypes, and enabling students to better understand persons of different races. Equally important, student body diversity promotes learning outcomes, whatever those might be, and better prepares students for an increasingly diverse workforce and society. So there you have it. That's supposed to be the benefit of diversity. It breaks down racial stereotypes, promotes cross-racial understanding, and enables students to better understand persons of different races. And Fischer is going to say, yeah, but when a judge comes along and is trying to evaluate whether these goals are being met by a race-neutral alternative, how do we ultimately know? How do we ultimately know whether these things have been accomplished or not? Can you see these processes working? Now, again, as someone who is broadly sympathetic for these ideas associated with affirmative action, at the same time, I worry a little bit about the court's response here, which is in essence to say, well, the university gave us this 39-page study about some stuff and how it wasn't met and whatnot. But how is that supposed to be compelling to the objector? The objector says, look, the university has not identified a clear enough target for us here. How can we be certain that these goals are being met? And the Supreme Court basically just says, just see what the university sent to us in this 39-page document. It looks like deference at that point. It looks like deference. And basically, the Supreme Court was not supposed to be giving any sort of deference to the university as related to the means that they might pursue of securing these benefits. So it looks a little bit strange. And I guess having read some of this SFA versus Harvard case, I'm worried about it now. And I don't know, maybe I was feeling a little bit cheeky when I first made this set of slides, but here's kind of a humorous clip to kind of get us in the mood of what the objection is. Maybe you've seen this show before.
On a show, this son of a bitch. Buddy, now explain to me how exactly we're going to calculate